Hello everyone. The purpose of today's lesson is to introduce you to the names of some of the major blood vessels in the human body, specifically the ones that are relevant to both the lecture and the laboratory section of this class. Now, in order to introduce you, I have provided for you a blank body diagram, such as the one seen here. Note that we can see parts of the cardiovascular system, so specifically the heart, and some of the major blood vessels. And so what we're going to do is actually draw in some of the remaining vessels. And the reason that I'm introducing this concept to you in this way is that it's really important to get a feel for where these blood vessels should be, right? Of course, you can look at a model. There's muscles and there's other tissues, there's bones, there's all sorts of different things. And you're just kind of like trying to find blood vessels that are seemingly randomly named. And so what this introduction is meant to do is familiarize you with essentially where exactly the blood is flowing. We'll see that it flows through a vessel and that vessel is actually going to change names as it crosses under a bone, as it crosses into a new muscle, as it enters a new region, right? So blood vessels aren't these isolated things, right? So they, blood flows from one vessel to the next completely continuously. The blood doesn't know that it has actually entered a new vessel, but we name different parts of the same continuous vessel according to where it is, what it's delivering blood to, and some other different features. And so what I'm going to do with you now is I am going to start with the arteries, right? So we're pretty much going to follow the pathway of the blood exiting from the left ventricle into the aorta, and then we're going to draw in some extra branches off of the aorta and see how those branches are going to change names depending on where they are. So bear with me. This can be a little bit tricky to draw on the screen here, but I will do my best for you. Also, I have given numbers to these different vessels off to the side. It's really difficult for me to draw in the names of these things, so I will refer to the blood vessels and maybe draw in their numbers for you. Okay, so let's start off here with this vessel. So that was not the intention here. This is the aorta, right? The ascending aortic arch, and then of course descending aorta goes behind the heart. Right, we know from our discussion of the lecture that there are three main branches off of the aortic arch. The first one is the brachiocephalic trunk. And again, bear with me for my little squiggles here. Okay, so this is number one, the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a second. The next branch is actually going to go behind this blue branch right here. This one is one of two common carotid arteries. Okay, and so this is number 10. Okay, this specifically is the left common carotid artery. Again, we'll come back to that. The third and final branch is the left subclavian artery, and so that is number 2. Keep in mind that there is a left and a right for a lot of these vessels, but not always. Okay, so those are the three branches that we already know about. Let's go back to the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, so the word trunk indicates that this vessel is about to split pretty soon, right? We saw this in the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk really quickly splits or bifurcates into the left and right pulmonary arteries. The brachiocephalic trunk is going to bifurcate. When that vessel splits, it changes name and is no longer the brachiocephalic trunk. Instead, one branch is going to split off and ascend the anterior neck to ultimately feed the face and the head. Okay, this branch is called the right common carotid artery. Right, so number 10, right common carotid artery. Now remember that the second branch off of the aorta is the left common carotid artery. Okay, so again, another number 10, only this time the left. And so these vessels are actually more or less symmetrical, running up either side of the neck, right? And ultimately they're going to go kind of just anterior to the ears. Okay. All right, we'll continue with that. The word common also means that this vessel is going to split. Generally, the word common indicates that this vessel is going to bifurcate to become two smaller vessels, an external and an internal, okay, with the same name. And so that's exactly what's going to happen here. It's a little difficult to draw in this two-dimensional model, but we can visualize it, okay? So just kind of between your ear and the angle of your mandible, the common carotid arteries are going to bifurcate. One of these vessels is going to stay on the superficial surface of the head. And so that's going to be the external carotid artery, in this case, the right external carotid artery. Okay. The other branch is going to, and again, this is a little bit difficult because it's a 2D model, but definitely refer to the head muscle model videos, and actually, you know, touching the head muscle model to figure out where this is, to see where these are, okay? The second branch is actually going to go inside the head, right? So this is actually going to be feeding the brain. And so this is an internal carotid artery, right? So number 12 here, internal carotid arteries, in this case, the right internal carotid artery. Okay, the external carotid arteries on the surface of the head are also going to split, okay? And they are going to split into the facial artery and the superficial temporal artery. Okay, and so on the left side over here, the left common carotid, note the internal carotid is going to go inside the head, so that one disappears and we don't see it anymore. The external carotid artery is going to stay on the superficial surface. One branch of the external carotid artery is going to pass to the face. Okay, and so definitely take a look at the model. This is going to pretty much pass over the mandible and feed the entire anterior surface of your head. All right, the second branch is going to continue up and ultimately feed your scalp. Okay, and so that one is called the superficial temporal artery, right? It is on the superficial surface, it's not inside, and it is pretty much traveling right over the temporal bone. Okay, I know that the head is a little bit wonky. Definitely take a look at those models and some diagrams from your text. Okay, but I really want you at this point to be visualizing and looking for these branching events. As soon as vessels branch, they are going to change names. Okay, so again, we have the aortic arch here. The brachiocephalic trunk splits or bifurcates here, one vessel, and the second vessel here is the right common carotid artery. This is the left common carotid artery. The common carotids stop being called the common carotids when they split into internal and external carotid arteries. The external carotid artery splits into the facial artery and the superficial temporal artery. Okay. And so knowing that these branching events occur and the vessels change names at those branching events will really help you to find the appropriate vessels on the models. Okay, so let's go back to the aorta. We know that the third and final branch off of the aorta that we know already is the left subclavian artery. Now, subclavian means under the clavicle, and so this vessel is actually going to travel just deep to the clavicle and laterally. So the blood is traveling out towards the shoulders in this vessel. Now that's the left subclavian. The right subclavian is the second branch off the brachiocephalic trunk. And so as soon as the right common carotid artery branches off the brachiocephalic trunk, the right subclavian artery, or then we call this vessel the right subclavian artery. And again, both of these vessels, the left and right subclavian arteries, are going to be just deep to the clavicle. Okay. Next, these vessels are symmetrical from here on out, right? Just gets a little bit wonky around the heart, but the arms, which is where we're going next, are symmetrical. I'm going to show you on the right side, but keep in mind that this is happening on both the right and the left. Okay, so the right subclavian artery, number 2 here, carries blood laterally just deep to the clavicle. Now, as soon as that vessel passes out from underneath the clavicle, it's essentially going to enter into the armpit area or the axillary or axillary region. Okay, and it's going to be pass blood on the medial side of the arm, kind of right in between the biceps brachii and the triceps brachii. Right, and so as soon as this vessel enters the axillary or the armpit region, it's going to change names, as we might imagine. Now it is called the right axillary or axillary artery. Okay, so just when it is between the clavicle and the muscles of the brachial region. All right, speaking of which, as soon as this vessel enters the brachial region, right, so essentially it is traveling or carrying blood just parallel to the humerus bone. This is the brachial region, and so we call this vessel the brachial artery. Right, hopefully a little bit clearer now. Right, in the antecubital fossa, or just proximal to the antecubital fossa, we have another bifurcation event. Right, so this brachial artery is going to split into 2 vessels. Now we know that in the forearm there are 2 bones that are parallel to one another when the person is in anatomical position. The lateral or thumb side bone is called the radius bone, and so we call this blood vessel the radial artery. Okay. The medial bone, when the person is in an anatomical position, is the ulna, and so we call this vessel the ulnar artery. Okay, so hopefully this is starting to seem pretty intuitive at this point. Okay, finally, these vessels actually join back together in the hand, and there's a lot of other branching events in the hands, but we just care about one vessel for now, and that is number 8, the superficial palmar arch. Okay, and so again, the radial and ulnar arteries join together and they form this loop, and essentially that loop has one branch for each finger. Okay, and so these, as you might imagine, they are in the digital region, so we call them the digital arteries. Okay, again, look for the loop in the hand of the models and in the diagrams. If you know it's there, right, if you can draw it into this blank diagram, you should be able to at least kind of know what to look for on a model. Okay, there is one more artery that I want to point out, or at least mention right here, and that is number 15, the internal thoracic artery. And so on this diagram, the internal thoracic artery would actually be coming out of the screen towards you, and it's actually embedded within the anterior thoracic wall. Okay, so essentially this is what is delivering blood to your anterior body wall, so your ribs, your intercostal muscles, right, internal and external intercostals, and so on and so forth. And so we can't necessarily draw that into the diagram right here, but it is there. On a model, you should look for it on the inside of the body wall in the chest. Okay, before we move on to the next slide, which is essentially looking down at the abdominal cavity and the legs, I do want to point out that the abdominal, or that the aorta, right, the descending aorta, travels behind the heart, so on the posterior side of the heart, and ultimately down into the abdominal cavity. And so this vessel changes names just like anything else, and the trigger for changing names is the diaphragm. Okay, and so while this vessel is in the abdominal cavity, oops, that's a little too thick, we call it, or sorry, when this vessel is in the thoracic cavity, we can call it the thoracic aorta, we can call it the descending aorta, or we can call it the descending thoracic aorta. Right, so lots of different names, and we've kind of gone over that before when we talked about the heart. Okay, as soon as this vessel crosses through the diaphragm, it changes names. So now it is in the abdominal cavity as opposed to the thoracic cavity. And so we call this vessel the abdominal aorta. So everything from the diaphragm all the way down until this vessel splits one more time. And that's where we're going next. Okay, so same image here, just a little bit lower. Okay, so we just talked about the abdominal aorta. I'm not going to really draw it in because you know, we already know it's there, okay? Now keep in mind that the abdominal aorta is actually all the way posterior in the abdominal cavity. So it's pretty much secured to the back of your body cavity by lots of tissue or lots of fascia. All of the visceral organs, right? So the stomach, the liver, the intestines, all of those viscera are anterior to the abdominal aorta. And so this is important for us right this moment because all of the branches off of the aorta that I'm going to draw for you are kind of coming out of the screen towards you, or actually towards these visceral organs. And so I will do my best to draw that in for you, but just keep in mind that these are not branching out laterally, they are branching out anteriorly. Okay, so we are going to add in these branches off of the abdominal aorta. Keep in mind that it is the left vessel. Okay, so the very first branch that branches anteriorly off of the abdominal aorta, my goodness, my finger is very big on the screen, is the celiac trunk. All right, so this is number 2. And as we know, the word trunk implies that this vessel is going to branch pretty darn soon here. And so the celiac trunk is going to branch into 3 sub-branches, or 3 vessels here. And this blood is going to feed the 3 superior most organs within the abdominal cavity. And so on a model or on a diagram, it's kind of difficult to tell which artery is going where. So definitely check out the model videos themselves. But for now, keep in mind that the celiac trunk is going to branch into 1, 2, and 3 vessels. Okay, the left gastric, the splenic, and the common hepatic artery. All right, so you'll see there's kind of 3 sub-branches off of the celiac trunk. For the most part on models and diagrams, these are cut off, and so it can be difficult to tell which one is going where. But a good question on this stuff would be, name the 3 branches off of the celiac trunk. And keep in mind that these branches send blood to the gastric, the stomach, to the spleen, and to the hepatic. Hepatic means liver. Okay. All right, so moving down the abdominal aorta, the next branch that we're going to see is the superior mesenteric. And again, these are coming right out of the center of the abdominal aorta here towards the intestines. And so this here would be number 6. Okay, the mesenteries are actually a double membraned, or a double layered membrane responsible for taking blood to and from the intestines. And so the intestines would be about, in this region of the body, and therefore this is the superior mesenteric artery feeding those intestines. Oops, wrong one here. Sorry about that. The highlighter. All right, I am going to highlight the abdominal aorta so that we can see it even when it disappears on the model. Okay. All right, next. Next thing I'm going to point out are actually 2 lateral branches. So the celiac trunk and the mesenteric arteries all kind of branch out straight forward, but these next branches here are going to branch out to the side, and essentially they are branching out to 2 organs called the kidneys. Okay, so the kidneys are also very posterior in your abdominal cavity, And so these arteries here are the renal arteries. So number 9, they are feeding the left and right kidney. Okay. Branching off of, or the next branches here that we're going to see are really skinny. Okay, so they're skinny, they're squiggly. These are called the gonadal arteries, right? So they ultimately are going to branch off of the aorta pretty far up. Okay, this has everything to do with the development of the reproductive system during your fetal growth, but essentially just inferior to the renal arteries, we're going to see the gonadal arteries branch off and then deliver blood all the way down to the gonads. Okay, the final branch, major branch off of the aorta after the gonadal arteries, this is the inferior mesenteric artery, right? So this is essentially feeding oxygenated blood to a different part of the intestines, we'll say. All right, we'll get into that later this term. Okay, so those are the main branches that feed the visceral organs. Okay, next we are going to see, as soon as, sorry about that, as soon as the abdominal aorta crosses into the pelvis, it is going to split. I swear, I'm trying to make this yellow here. Okay, as soon as the abdominal aorta passes into the pelvis, it is going to bifurcate again. All right, so this is the aorta splitting into the two halves that we're talking about now. Okay. Okay. The first branch, sorry about this, guys. The first branch here is the common iliac arteries. So number 10 here. Okay, so common indicates it's going to split into internal and external really soon. Iliac is implying that it is within the ilium, so within the hip bones. Okay, and just as we would expect, the iliac arteries, or common iliac arteries, split into internal, this is on both sides, and external. Okay, so the internal are actually going to stay inside the pelvis. Okay, and they're going to deliver oxygenated blood to things like the urinary bladder. Okay, the external iliac artery, so number 12 right here, this is ultimately going to deliver blood down the entire leg. Okay, the external iliac artery stops being the external iliac artery when it crosses over the pelvis. Okay, so it's going to cross over the pubic bone, and of course, then it's going to change names once again. Okay, as soon as it crosses over the pelvis, it's going to travel down the medial and then ultimately the posterior side of the leg. This is called, number 13, the femoral artery, right, because it's in the femoral region. Okay. This vessel passes around to the posterior side of the leg, and in order to show you posterior, I am going to draw dotted lines. Okay, or try to draw dotted lines. Okay, so at this point, the vessel has passed around to the back of the knee or to the popliteal region, and so this would be the popliteal artery. Okay, it continues to travel down the posterior side of the leg. Okay, so all the way down the posterior side. This is called number 16, the posterior tibial artery, okay, because it is literally behind the tibia, behind the shin bone. Final vessel that we're going to look at on this particular diagram before we switch over to the veins, and that is the anterior tibial arteries. The anterior tibial arteries bifurcate they split off of the posterior tibial artery, and it's actually going to pass between the tibia and the fibula through that interosseous membrane and come out on the anterior side of the shin. Okay, and so to show that this vessel is now going to be on the shin as opposed to in the calf, I'm drawing a solid line. All right, so we see a branching event in the back of the leg, and this is therefore the number 15, the anterior tibial artery. Okay, so again, knowing what vessels branch off the aorta, branch off of any other vessel, is going to be really important in helping you to find the vessels that you're looking for, on the models, that is. Okay, so now let us go through the veins. And so I know that the veins, of course, are draining the blood from the extremities back up to the heart. And so to follow the pathway of blood, we would really have to start like in the fingers and toes and work our way back to the heart. Let us instead, just for simplicity, go in reverse, right? So we'll start at the heart and then work our way out to the extremities. Also, I am going to change the color here so that we know these are veins, not arteries anymore. Okay, so first of all, we know that there are two main ways of draining the blood back into the heart. All right, one of them is the IVC. Okay, so number 2, inferior vena cava. We'll pick up with that in just a moment here. And we also have the superior vena cava, right? Both of these are going to be draining blood back into the right atrium of the heart. Okay, again, working in reverse of the actual flow of the blood, we see that the superior vena cava actually includes 2 branches. So, it bifurcates, it's splitting here. Here is one branch, and here is the second branch. Okay. These 2 branches are collectively called the right and left brachiocephalic veins. Right? So we have the SVC. 2 branches from the SVC are the brachiocephalic veins. Now keep in mind that we have a brachiocephalic trunk. The trunk is the artery. The brachiocephalic veins, right and left, are the veins. Okay. Soon enough, the brachiocephalic veins are also going to bifurcate. They're going to split, and this is really nice and symmetrical here for us. Here, the first branch, when the brachiocephalic veins stop being called the brachiocephalic veins, we have the jugular veins. All right, so first we have the first we have the internal jugular veins, right? So number 4, right? And they are ultimately going to be draining blood from inside the head, okay? And so just like the carotid arteries, these are going to pass on the anterior side of your neck, okay? Unlike in the arteries, the internal and external jugular veins are actually branches off of these larger vessels down here in the thoracic cavity, okay? As opposed to being branches up here, okay? So let us name these vessels down here, okay? Once the internal jugular veins are going to branch off of the brachiocephalic veins, we name the remaining branch the subclavian veins. So number 6, the left and right subclavian veins. Okay. The external jugular veins, number 3, are going to be a branch directly off of the subclavian veins. Okay. So again, what we have here is the SVC, okay, branching event. These are the right and the left brachiocephalic veins. We branch yet again. left subclavian vein, left internal jugular vein, and then there would be another branch here, the left external jugular vein. Okay, let us now follow the right side once again. Okay, the subclavian vein stops being called the subclavian vein when it passes into the axillary or axillary region. All right, so number 7 is the axillary. And a lot of times we are going to see, for the most part, that there's a lot of symmetry, a lot of similarities between the arteries and the veins, and that's a beautiful thing. We do get a little bit more complexity in the veins, however, and so I'm going to do my best to draw this in for you. We'll follow the stuff that looks familiar first, right? So here is the axillary or axillary vein. Okay, this vein is then going to split. It's going to bifurcate pretty quickly. Okay, so we'll follow the first branch here now. And the first branch is going to travel down the medial side of the arm. Okay, this branch is going to be called the basilic vein. All right, so number 10, the basilic vein. Okay, so it's already starting to look just a little bit different. The other branch off of the subclavian vein, number 7, is actually going to pass around to the posterior side of the humerus. And so now, instead of drawing dots, I'm going to change colors here. This branch off of the axillary artery is passing around to the posterior side of the arm. Okay, this vessel is called the brachial vein. Okay, so again, this is posterior as opposed to number 10, the basilic vein, which is medial and slightly anterior. All right, just like we saw with the arteries, this vessel is going to bifurcate. It's going to split. The lateral vessel is going to be called, number 12, the radial vein, and the medial vessel is going to be called the ulnar vein. Okay, keep in mind that the veins are capacitance vessels. We actually have more veins than we have arteries. We have more space, more volume within these vessels to hold that additional blood volume. Okay, so we are going to see more veins in the arms and the legs than we would arteries. Okay, let's go back up to the axillary or axillary artery. A second branch off of the subclavian, it will produce a vessel that is going to travel down the lateral anterior side of the arm. Okay, this vessel is going to be called the cephalic vein. I know that's a little bit confusing. Cephalic usually means head, but this here is the cephalic vein. All right, so once again, let me point out that the subclavian vein is going to bifurcate into the cephalic, which runs all the way down the lateral anterior side of the arm. The second branch of the subclavian is the axillary or axillary. The axillary splits again. The branch that travels down the anterior medial side of the arm is the basilic vein. The posterior branch is the brachial vein, which splits into the radial and the ulnar. Okay, so I know a little bit more complex than we experienced with the arms. Okay, final notes here. We do have a couple extra vessels here at the bottom. Vertebral veins. These veins, and actually arteries as well, travel through the transverse foramina of your cervical spine, right? So these are protected vessels. They are going to, excuse me, make sure that blood gets to the brain and drains from the brain. Make sure this happens. It's just kind of like a backup circulation to get to the brain and from the brain. And so these we cannot see on any of our models, but I want you to be aware that they are present within your cervical spine. All right, contrast the vertebral veins with the jugular veins. right? As well as the carotid arteries. These vessels are like super exposed in the anterior side of your throat. Okay, and while they are the primary circulation to your head, it is nice to have some extra vessels that are protected by bone to assure that that blood is going to get to your brain. Next, we have the internal thoracic vein. This travels with the thoracic artery that we talked about on a couple slides ago now. This is essentially draining the blood from your body wall. And the anterior intercostal veins. Each one of these is a branch off of the internal thoracic vein, and it is draining deoxygenated blood from the intercostal muscles, so between each of your ribs. Okay, on the next slide, we are going to start looking at the abdominal cavity. Okay, so we are passing down out of the thoracic and into the abdominal. The inferior vena cava, which of course is this one right here, IVC. This doesn't change names regardless of whether it's in the abdominal or thoracic cavity. Yeah, so it doesn't change names. And as we go into the abdominal cavity, keep in mind that there is a pretty major portal system within the abdominal cavity. Okay, so there are a series of digestive organs here, right, which of course are picking up nutrients after or while oxygen is being delivered to those intestinal tissues or to those gastric tissues. This nutrient-rich blood doesn't just get dumped directly into the IVC. Instead, this nutrient-rich blood, after passing through the first capillary bed within the intestines, or the mesenteric arteries, right? Instead, all of these different vessels are going to drain blood through the liver before it returns to the IVC. And so remember, the liver's job is to filter and modify whatever is in the blood. So it's ultimately going to take up any extra stuff, any extra nutrients that are in the blood and store them and process them into a more usable form. Okay, so in the abdominal cavity, we're not going to see, all of those different mesenteric veins. We're not going to see gastric veins, none of that. Instead, we are going to see drainage of veins into the liver. Okay, so with that in mind, remember that the liver is essentially a big triangular organ right here, just inferior to the diaphragm. Okay. Also remember that the IVC is the right vessel. Okay, the IVC is ultimately going to split in the same way that the abdominal aorta did as well. Okay, so let's add in some vessels. We're going to start with the hepatic portal vein. Now remember, all of the blood from the intestines, from the spleen, from the stomach, from the pancreas, all of that blood is going to pass through the liver before it returns to the IVC and to the right atrium. And so there's actually a little vessel on the bottom of the liver, right? So when you're looking on a model, you would actually have to flip the model over, look at the inferior surface, and you'll see lots of different vessels here. You'll see a green one, a red one, and a purple or blue one. And the purple or blue one is the hepatic portal vein. Okay, so remember, a portal system allows blood to pass through 2 capillary beds instead of just 1 capillary bed before returning to the heart, right? So this is the hepatic portal vein delivering blood up to the liver. Okay, the liver does its thing, and ultimately it is going to drain that deoxygenated, nutrient-poor blood back into the IVC. And so on the superior surface of the liver, we are going to see another vein, and that is the hepatic vein, right? Portal indicates it's going to a second capillary bed, just normal old hepatic vein that is draining blood out of the liver. Okay, the mesenteric veins themselves, we're not going to draw in here, but keep in mind that they do exist. They just aren't going to be draining into the IVC directly. So in order to see these veins, you would have to look on the posterior side of the intestine portion of the model, right? Again, take a look at those videos for more clarity. Okay. There are a couple veins that don't first pass through the liver. And so I'm going to draw them in here in a different color so that we can see them. The renal veins, right? So branching out to either kidney. Okay. So these are the renal veins, number 5, the right and the left. The kidneys are their own filter, so they don't have to send the blood through a portal or through a second portal system. The next pair is a little bit tricky, the gonadal veins. One of these veins, all right, again, squiggly, thin, coming directly from the gonads. One branch is the right gonadal vein is going to drain directly into the IVC, so that is number 6 here. The second is going to drain into the renal artery, right? And the reason for this is just the positioning of the IVC versus the aorta, right? So this is also a gonadal vein. Okay, let's move on down here. In the abdominal aorta, we saw that when it bifurcated in the pelvis, we called those 2 big branches the common iliac arteries. And so now these 2 big branches in the ilium are called the common, it's about to split, iliac, it's in the pelvis, veins. Okay, so as soon as the IVC splits, we call these 2 big branches, number 7, the common iliac veins. They, of course, are going to split again. One branch is going to drain blood from things like the urinary bladder. That is the internal iliac vein, number 8. And the remaining blood vessel is ultimately going to be draining blood from the legs. Okay, as soon as that vessel crosses over the pelvis, okay, it is going to change names, of course, and in fact, it's going to split right away. This time, we're going to have one branch that's super long and is going to travel down the medial side of the leg and ultimately be draining blood from the foot. Excuse me. This vessel is called the great saphenous or great saphenous vein. All right, number 11, the longest vein in the entire body. Okay, the other branch, which I'm going to draw as a separate color here, is going to branch and travel around to the posterior side of the leg, all right, traveling down parallel to the femur. Therefore, we call this the femoral vein. And again, on the posterior side of the leg, passes behind the knee in the popliteal region, so a popliteal vein. And once again, we see a branching event. One branch is going to stay in the posterior of the calf, posterior tibial vein. The other branch passes through the interosseous membrane between the tibia and the fibula, draining blood from the shin. Okay, so that would be the anterior tibial artery. Okay, so you would be able to see the leg. You can see some of the veins on the legs in the leg model, but not all of them. Pretty much you can see the femoral vein and the popliteal vein, and that's about it in the leg model. Okay, so thank you guys for watching. I hope that this helps you to figure out what or where the vessels are and where you should be looking for them. Thank you so much.